It seems that Russia's main strategy in its war is now attrition and perseverance. Putin hopes that the commitment of the West to Ukraine will decline as the horror drags on for month after month. Russian info ops have now turned to amplifying terror messages and underscoring the economic and social costs for the West in its continuing support for Ukraine's military resistance. But how can so-called war fatigue be countered among the allies, and especially the attention of the public engaged over a long period? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube and help more people find our fantastic guests. Olga Tokariuk is an independent journalist and non-resident fellow at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, based in Ukraine. Her professional interests include international relations and disinformation research. Olga has vast experience working with Ukrainian and international media. Her reports have been published and aired by Time, The Washington Post, The Daily Beast, NPR, New Lines Magazine, Monocle, EFE in Spain, Il Foglio, and ANSA in Italy. She is a former head of foreign news desk at the independent Ukrainian Hromadske TV and has an MA in journalism from Taras Shevchenko University of Kiev. And I should also say that Olga is now based in the UK. And even though we're on Zoom, she's only down the road from me. And this is the second time that we've now spoken on the channel. So if you like this interview, do please also check out the first conversation we had last year. Olga, welcome back.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me again. It's a pleasure to chat to you.
Well, let's start with war fatigue, because this isn't just an outcome of the way Western media works, is it? War fatigue is a real strategy adopted by Russia that seeks to use refugees, energy, economic threat to really suck the energy out of the Western allies and the public who are supporting Ukraine.
Yes, you are absolutely right. You know, the Russian full-scale aggression against Ukraine began almost a year ago, and a year into this war, inevitably we are seeing that the attention to what is happening in Ukraine is fading. People somehow get used to the fact that there is a war in Ukraine, and it's not as prominent in the newscasts and in the newspapers as it used to be. Well, this is something that had to be expected, obviously, although I would say that you know, the fears that were there in Ukraine about Ukraine disappearing from the front pages and from the broadcasts were somewhat exaggerated. There are several reasons for why it actually didn't happen, and one of them is that actually Russian aggression in Ukraine continues, and Russia is continuing to make headlines by committing atrocities in Ukraine. The second reason is that Ukrainian army, unexpectedly to many Western observers, managed to fare much better than they predicted, and to liberate a large part of the territory that was initially occupied by Russia. So Ukraine made headlines again with this impressive counteroffensives in Kharkiv region, then in Kherson region. Recently, Ukrainian officials made predictions that a new counteroffensive is planned for the spring. In this way, they are, I think, also trying to attract the attention of the media and to keep Ukraine in focus, but by, you know, throwing these statements from time to time. And the third reason because why actually Ukraine did not disappear completely and it's still in the news is because Ukraine is managing to communicate quite efficiently, both on the level of the government officials, and the President Zelensky proved to be a very efficient communicator with, you know, his speeches that were largely made online via video link to various parliaments, to you know, audiences in so many countries across the world, but also with his first foreign trip to the US that was made in the end of last year, when he spoke in Congress to a huge, you know, applauses from both parties in the US Congress when he met with the US President Joe Biden. I think, again, you know, it was a very smart move to bring Ukraine back on the agenda and into the news, and to remind that the war in Ukraine is still going on, but most importantly, that Ukrainians still resist, that they are not tired, that they are not exhausted, that they are not giving up, and that they need the support to be increased and to continue in the new year.
And that engagement with US politicians is especially important, isn't it? Because, not to put too fine a point in it, there are many in the Republican Party, the extreme wing of the Republican Party, and I have to say, you know, many don't align with those points of view, but there are people there who are repeating Russian propaganda narratives, and to all intents and purposes could be classified as assets of the Putin regime. I think everyone knows who many of them are. And there are even some anchors on, say, Fox News and some of the slightly more right-wing media elements that actively repeat Russian propaganda. I'm thinking here particularly of Tucker Carlson. And we know that these are Russian narratives because Russian state television actually repeats the clips endlessly of Tucker Carlson and some of those people like him. So how important do you think Zelensky's address was, given that sort of, I wouldn't say fragile state of US opinion, but the fact there are some fairly negative voices in the background?
Well, I think it was very important, you know, this visit in person, although some of the actors that you mentioned, they tried to instrumentalize and manipulate his visit by, you know, criticizing that he was not wearing a suit, that he was in his military t-shirt, and he was not looking up to the occasion. So, you know, trying to grasp, like to climb the mirrors and, you know, just to stick to some little petty things only to discredit somehow him and then his plight and, you know, the fight of the Ukrainian people. But I think those voices, they looked really marginal and did not have a lot of traction among the decision makers. Yes, there are some parts of the political establishment in the Republican Party, especially, as you mentioned, and well, obviously the former president Donald Trump and his son, they also use their social media platforms to, you know, criticize Zelensky and to accuse him of begging and just, you know, asking for the American money lining his pockets or whatever, you know, they are saying. But thankfully, it doesn't look like these efforts by these actors, they are really, you know, having any significant impact on the US government policy and on the public opinion. We see that the support to Ukraine remains very high in the US. Also, the elections, the midterm elections, they have proven not to be as favorable for the Republicans as they hoped for. And for Ukraine, this is good news because it means that most likely the bipartisan support and the support of the Congress will be maintained in the new year. So while, of course, we should be conscious and we should, you know, name and shame these actors who it looks very likely also have some links to the Russian state. It's not just in the US. We are seeing, you know, the actors like this, they exist in many countries in Europe as well, and notably in Germany, in Italy. But I think the most important outcome for now is that all their efforts have been unable so far to disrupt the support to Ukraine, and there is still large support at the level of the public opinion and also reflected in the government's strategy, because the governments react to what the people want. And that's the most important, that the audiences still, they seem to be pretty resilient, at least in the Western countries, to all these attempts by Russian state actors and Russian assets abroad to discredit Ukraine, to discredit Ukrainian resistance, and to somehow, undermine the support that Ukraine is getting.
And of course, if we go back to 2014, that kind of hybrid information warfare was far more effective when they were able to use non-compliance of the Minsk Accords, where they were able to sort of spin all sorts of devious propaganda narratives around the whole sort of, liberation, et cetera, of Donbass. They were able to do that when the warfare was at a relatively low scale and confined to a particular area without any sort of major sort of headline brutality. We know behind the scenes there's going to be a lot of brutality uncovered in future years when Donbass is liberated, abductions, disappearances, torture, but they're able to hide that stuff away. Do you think the propaganda narratives are now failing simply because Russian brutality, Russian crimes are so overt and so obvious, and of course are now documented far more widely?
Well, partially, yes, I think it is because of that, what Russia has been doing in Ukraine since February 24th, 2022 was such an open, brutal aggression, and all the Russian justifications of this war were a total nonsense, the notion that Ukraine needs to be denazified, or recently they came up with the justification that Ukraine needs to be desatanized, that it was possessed by devils. So it sounds, completely made up, and it is completely made up. There is no valid reason for Russia to, wage this war, the war that is waged not as much against the military, but against the civilian population, with all the indiscriminate bombings of residential areas, hospitals, schools, and most recently infrastructure facilities to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, of heating, of water supply. So Russia is doing that deliberately, and there is no justification to that from the point of international law and also from the point of basic humanity. And that's why I think the narratives somehow aimed at justifying this war, blaming Ukrainians for this or that, they are failing because it's just like people do not buy them and they do not see the Russian cause. And then there is another aspect of this, is I think that Russia really does not present any constructive alternative, to the Western model or to the democratic model. So for Ukrainians, obviously, who have been moving closer and closer with the West, with the EU, with NATO, Ukrainians, the support for joining the EU and NATO in Ukraine is exceeding 80% at the moment, so all-time high. But also for foreign audiences, what kind of model modern Russia represents. If we are speaking about some objective reality, not propaganda, the economy that is fully reliant on hydrocarbons, the oligarchic system, the low level of life of the population, besides several metropolitan centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, no human rights, no respect of minority, LGBT rights. So this is not an appealing model of development. So it's not only about the system of governance, the authoritarian system, but also all other aspects of life that are not appealing to Ukrainians or other people outside of Russia. And of course, add to this the aggressive war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, that it has been waging and supporting in the previous years in Syria, in Georgia, in Chechnya, and you have a full picture. So, that's why I think the Russian narratives are failing with many people in the West, at least, is because first, what Russia is doing is so openly brutal and unjustifiable, and second is because Russia presents no appealing model of development.
And I think that's interesting because, of course, if we look at marketing techniques, it almost never works if you try to market to a negative. And of course, almost all the values associated with Russian actions are negative. So it's quite a tough call there. On the other hand, Ukraine has a lot of positives, but we know that the Western media has a fairly short-term attention span. We also know that news coverage is typically not very strategic. You know, news coverage in the West covers what's happening now, things, actions taking place in the present time, with relatively little analysis, at least on the sort of mainstream sort of news media. Ukraine, therefore, has had to shape its actions and package them up in a certain way to make them incredibly appealing for news headlines. And I'm thinking in particular of the attack on the Kerch Bridge. It managed to tick a number of boxes. You know, strategically, it's important to knock out what is, you know, an essential logistic supply line for Ukraine, and of course for the entire Russian military in the south. But at the same time, by ensuring that webcam footage or drone footage is available, you're able to package these events up in a way that can take up a lot of media real estate. So I think, I don't know your thoughts on that, working in the media itself. Has Ukraine been incredibly effective at actually generating newsprint?
Well, I think that there is definitely a strategy, to keep the interest on Ukraine in the world media. And that strategy is executed both by the government officials, by President Zelensky with his, daily addresses, both to Ukrainian and foreign public. But also there are teams, some of them are grassroots teams with no connection to the government, some, social media accounts who are working very hard on creating content that would be appealing to audiences outside of Ukraine, that would keep the focus of attention on Ukraine. And here I'm referring not just to NAFO or the famous social media campaigns trolling Russian officials, exposing Russian lies and disinformation on social media, but also to sometimes some ordinary, Ukrainians or just Ukrainian individuals who are creating content explaining Ukraine, what Ukraine is, what Ukraine's history is, what Ukraine's art is. Just, several examples that come to my mind is, for example, my colleague and friend Volodymyr Yermolenko and his podcast, Ukraine World, the website, they are making, he and his wife, Tatiana Harkova, they are making podcasts both for Ukrainian and foreign audience in English and in French, most recently. Not just analyzing the current situation in Ukraine, but also because they both have background in philosophy, in literature, so they are speaking wider, about Ukrainian philosophical tradition, about Ukrainian literary tradition, about Ukrainian place in the European civilization, in the European, Western space of ideas, how Ukrainian philosophers and artists and writers and poets, how they were connected and how the contemporary ones are connected to the modern, European and Western tradition. So I think this becomes increasingly important as this maybe a flow of news from Ukraine a bit slows down, and it's not breaking news anymore, but there is still interest in Ukraine. So many people across the world have discovered Ukraine for the first time after Russian full-scale invasion, and they are keen to learn more about this country, about its history, not through a Russian imperialistic lens as one people or brotherly nations, but the origins of this Ukrainian resistance, the origins of Ukrainian identity. What does Ukrainian identity really mean? Is it an ethno-linguistic identity centered around the language and the ethnicity, or is it an identity that is based on values, on a multi-ethnic, multilingual identity? And this is actually what Ukrainian identity is the second type of identity. So, I think it's really very important that this effort is going on now by, as I say, like these people that I mentioned, and there are so many others. There is, for example, an account on Twitter that I really like, which is called Ukrainian Art History. It is managed by a young woman named Oksana Semenik, who was under occupation in Bucha in March last year. Then she managed to escape with her boyfriend, who is my former colleague, so a very interconnected world. And she's an art historian, and then her account on Twitter, like every day she posts something about Ukrainian art history, and she tries also to decolonize the perception of Ukrainian art, which was and still is so often presented as Russian, in museums of the world, such as Met in New York or others. Very often the work of Ukrainian artists is described as Russian. And and she's explaining why it is not, why this person actually was from Ukraine. We are speaking about Kazimir Malevich, for example, and or other world famous artists that are still perceived as Russian, but in fact they are not. So I think this kind of small efforts are as important as the communication of the government, as the media coverage of the current war, because they help people who just discovered Ukraine but are eager to learn more, to understand it better, to understand the history, to understand the art, to understand the civic spirit, the identity of Ukrainians better.
And that's an interesting point there. And I'll come in a minute to the work of the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora, because it's incredibly important and active. But, this year, or rather last year, immersing myself as well into many of the channels and the podcasts that you've talked about, it's quite shocking, isn't it, to realize, one of my favorite Russian inverted commas artists was Ilya Repin. And, I've actually visited his museum studio. And I knew that some of his pictures were on Ukrainian themes, but had no idea that he was, in essence, a Ukrainian artist.
Yes, this cultural appropriation that Russian Empire and the Soviet Union was conducting for centuries by declaring, all the artists or any prominent figures from its colonial subjects as Russian is something really remarkable. And the reverse process has been really slow. Both, in Russia it's not happening at all, but even in this former, Russian colonies, if we can call them like this, and also outside of them, because it also needed some time for the people here, even in Ukraine, in other parts of the former Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, to understand what has been happening to them and to their ancestors generations before, the way that how the Russian culture, Russian language was imposed on them, and everything that is theirs was, something that was like considered of higher artistic value was declared Russian, and something that was considered of lower artistic value declared non-important, or something ridiculous, or something, to be ashamed of, like a Ukrainian language that was seen as a language of the peasants, that it was not helpful to you to speak Ukrainian if you wanted to make a career in the Soviet Union, for example. That's even like, I'm speaking from the experience of my family, and my elder sister, who was sent to study in Russian school just because she had higher chances to enter the university if she graduated from a school, with the language of education Russian and not Ukrainian. So this was in late 1980s, in the last years of the Soviet Union. But this legacy, it was so strong that many Ukrainians actually they just started to reconsider their own identity, their past, everything they've been told about their country, about the Soviet Union, about Russian Empire, about what is kind of superior and what is inferior, and this process is still going on. So yeah, it is going on in parallel in Ukraine and abroad, with also Ukrainians who are kind of rediscovering themselves and rediscovering their identity, their culture, their history, and they are more willing to share also, what they discover with the outside world.
And this is an important topic, and I think this is going to, the question here is going to probably upset some people. But there are great products of Russian culture. I mean, there's great music, there is great literature, and like a lot of English literature, you know, there is a lot of colonial attitudes imbued in 19th century literature, but the same could also be said of French, German, British literature as well. It's just that, you know, Britain's gone through a process and is going through a process still of decolonization. Therefore, the you know, the colonial attitudes in past literature can be openly condemned, and you can still look at the literature and you can take value from it. Russia hasn't gone through that process of decolonization, so at the moment I know a lot of people are rejecting Russian culture wholesale, and I can understand why. And I want this to be a sort of balanced question, because yes, there are great products of genius that have come out of Russia, but at the same time, a really strong element in Russian historical culture which hasn't been recognized is cultural appropriation, and it is theft. And this is something, coming back to Ilya Repin, really was brought home to me. His museum studio is based in I think it's Karelia. It's I think we went out there from St. Petersburg. It's a few hours by train out into the countryside. And when you get there, you realize that when he was living and working there, those territories were part of Finland. The cities, the villages, everything about them was part of Finland, and it was appropriated by Russia. And I think that is where this crucial element in Russian civilization comes in, that theft and appropriation is a huge part of it. And if we look at the bigger picture, even Kievan Rus, the idea of the origins of the Russian identity and state itself, have been kind of appropriated. And what was essentially Ukrainian, you know, it's quite an interesting sleight of hand, isn't it, to say that as the inheritors of Kievan Rus, they take the name, you take the location, you take the culture, the religion, and you take everything. And by being the inheritor, you somehow diminish, you know, the place that actually originated all of these things. So I think this idea of sort of theft and appropriation does need to be tackled in Russian culture, and many Russians are obviously not yet at a place when they've started doing that.
Yes, well, you know, I absolutely agree with these observations that theft and cultural appropriation is something that has been happening for centuries, that is still continuing, and that is completely normalized in Russia, you know, just declaring that, well, this has always been Russia, or this has always been a part of Russia. As you know, one of the recent examples is this very popular narrative about Crimea, that, you know, Russia annexed Crimea because Crimea has always been Russian, which is not true. Crimea was a part of the Russian Empire, well, for 300 years, but before that, it was never a land of ethnic Russians or, you know, ethnic Ukrainians for that matter. It was a land of Crimean Tatars, the autochthonous population that has been exterminated, most notably by Stalin in the 1940s, when, you know, hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars were deported to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, and were only able to return after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now there is again a full-scale campaign of repression against the Crimean Tatar population in Crimea after the Russian occupation and annexation in 2014. You know, and when I hear this, you know, Russian propaganda line repeated by some experts in Italy, notably, because that happened to me a lot to hear this thing in Italy, that, you know, Crimea has always been Russian. It makes me furious, because it wasn't. This is a lie, you know, but this is something that Russians not only were able to convince their population of, and, you know, build their history, their historiography on, and write it into their textbooks, but so many people in the West are also keen to repeat that without, you know, questioning, without actually looking at the facts. And what you said about Kievan Rus, it's the same. You know, that Kiev was founded several centuries before Moscow was, and now Russia says that somehow Kiev was, you know, the part of the center of the Russian world, or from where Russia started. But this is completely not the case. And, you know, this Kiev Rus state was founded based very much on the northern traditions of the Vikings who came from the north. So it was not just completely ethnically, you know, Slavic state. So we can't even speak that there were just Slavs. There were mixture of different people who established this, who established Kyiv, who established this state. And so it's it is true that the history is written by the winners, and it happened that Russia also appropriated and actually stole so many victories, as the victory in the Second World War, something again, something that we need to talk about. And the notion of Russians as those who won the Second World War, or Russians as those who suffered the most, maybe second to Jews, in the World War II. This is also something that needs to be deconstructed, because if we look at the facts and at the numbers, we will see that the major suffering and the biggest per capita losses in terms of in relation to the population were sustained by Ukraine and Belarus, not by Russia. However, still in Germany, for example, it is Germany feels historical guilt in front of Russians, in front of Jews, but not in front of Ukrainians and Belarusians. And Germany, was agreeing to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and one of justifications given by President Frank-Walter Steinmeier is because Germany feels in debt to Russia, and that's why it agrees to this clearly geopolitical projects undermining Ukraine, because somehow they feel guilt towards Russians, but they do not feel any guilt towards Ukrainians, who actually suffered so much more, and that Ukraine was also seen by Germans as this again, the land to be colonized, to be used, the population to be used as forced laborers or to be exterminated. And this, again, this reckoning of, with the suffering that was caused by Nazis to Ukraine is something that Germany still has to do. And it was brilliantly addressed by Timothy Snyder in his course of lectures on Ukraine history at Yale University. It's available on YouTube, and I encourage your viewers to watch it to understand better Ukrainian history, and also this problematic matters related to the colonization, decolonization, imperialistic attitude towards Ukraine, not just on behalf of Russia, but also on behalf of Germany or other Western powers.
I was going to say Germany's attitude is perverse, because and I agree. Timothy Schneider's lectures are fantastic. Also, the book Bloodlands is truly horrifying, and that's something people should read to understand what went on. But the population loss as a proportion of population was incredibly high in Ukraine compared to other republics within the Soviet Union. But it also came on the heels of its own revolution being crushed by the Bolsheviks, and then the Holodomor, and then in terms of Stalin's purges, probably the percentage of the intelligentsia who were eliminated by Stalin was the highest, again, of any of the republics, including Russia itself. And I've read some figures that up to 80% of writers, cultural figures, academics were physically killed by Stalin's regime. So this process of eliminating the intellectual and material culture of Ukraine, then followed by the Second World War, is truly horrific, isn't it? And the other aspect that perhaps the Germans ignore is that there were, damage to Russian cities and villages, absolutely, but the main physical devastation of the architecture and the urban infrastructure and all the culture that is associated with that, it's Belarus and Ukraine that were almost erased from the map physically.
Yes, exactly. Speaking about the Stalin's purges, just some context that in the early 1920s, after Ukraine, was included to be a part of the Soviet Union, there was a very brief period of so-called Ukrainization, when Ukrainian cultural figures were allowed to, write and create and perform in their own language, which led to really a period that is known in Ukrainian history as a Renaissance of the 1920s and early 1930s. But then it was ended very abruptly and in a very bloody manner in early 1930s, in 1932 and 1933. so many of these artists, of these cultural figures, of these writers who were really doing, and were creating the masterpieces that were the level of, European modernism at the time, that were really very high quality. I'm speaking about, the poets and the artists and the painters and the writers. So many of them were executed in 1932 and 1933. They were just shot. That's why they are known, this period, as executed Renaissance. And it left profound scars on on Ukrainian society, on the Ukrainian spirit, because this process of encouragement of Ukrainian everything Ukrainian was so brief, but it gave so many hopes. And then it was ended in such a brutal manner. And then, of course, after this, the execution of the intelligentsia, the Holodomor, the artificial famine aimed at peasants followed to crush the resistance of Ukrainian peasants, of the villagers who were opposed to collectivization, to the Soviet economical system of just seizing all the assets and redistributing them. The centralized state control over all the agricultural lands and all the assets that peasants had. So in Holodomor, around 4 million people, and this is the lower estimate, were exterminated by Stalin, by the Soviet regime, people who were just, they died of hunger because all the foodstuffs were taken away from them. So one very tragic event followed by the other. Then, of course, the World War II, when Ukraine again was the victim at the hands of two imperial powers, of Russians from the one side and the Nazis, the Germans on the other side. And you mentioned the book Bloodlands, which is exactly, it talks about that. So, like all this collective traumas, they are so imprinted on the Ukrainian psyche, on the, in Ukrainian society, that seeing what Russia is doing now, has been doing for almost a year, in this full-scale war, it brings so many triggers from the Ukrainian collective memory, from the stories that we heard from our grandparents, and stories that they were very reluctant to share, but sometimes they did. And these repressions in the Soviet Union, so they did not end, in the 1930s or after the World War II. So the gulags were there, where Ukrainian intelligentsia was sent. They were there until the very last years of the Soviet Union. In 1985, the year when I was born, a Ukrainian poet, Vasil Stus, died in a Soviet gulag, who was sentenced for, his treason to the Soviet Union, or anti-Soviet activity, or his, human rights activism, as many members of the Ukrainian Helsinki group were. So just a pretext to get rid of, again, strong figures in the Ukrainian cultural sphere who could lead other people, who could inspire resistance to the Soviet rule.
And of course, Russia has been able to create narratives through that period, which mostly managed to cover these up. As far as the outside world is concerned, it has managed to put a big sort of blanket over Ukraine, to make it disappear from world history. I think that's the big difference we're seeing now, isn't it? And that leads me on to my next question, is that the Ukrainian diaspora of writers, cultural figures, artists are vocal now in a way that we've not seen before in Western capitals around the world. Does it feel different now that Ukrainians are determined for it not to disappear again, and for Russia not to succeed?
Well, I think most Ukrainians, what they feel now is an existential threat, to their state, to their identity, to their culture, to the independence. Well, Ukraine tried to proclaim its independence 5 times in the 20th century, and 4 attempts were unsuccessful. Only the 5th attempt in 1991 was successful. So there is a feeling that, that independence of Ukraine is something that generations of Ukrainians were fighting for, but they failed so many times, and they paid for these failures with, extermination and the killings and mass murders and the torture and the repressions. And that's why I think now, after like 30 years that Ukraine has been independent, there is a complete consensus among Ukrainians that we cannot lose this independence again, because that would mean even more death and destruction and terror and repression. And we are seeing what Russians are doing on the occupied territories of Ukraine. They are doing exactly that. They are repeating what they have been doing to Ukrainians throughout the 20th century and the centuries before. So I think this consensus, it also leads to Ukrainians being so vocal, and speaking up and kind of putting what is happening now in the historical context and trying to explain, well, this is not a coincidence. This is not something extraordinary or unusual what Russia is doing now in Ukraine. This is something that Russians have been doing, or when they were not able to do, but they were still, kind of speaking about it, about, their intention to do that, as they were increasingly in the last 8 years. And here we are back to the issue of, propaganda and what has been discussed, what has been told about Ukraine on Russian TV, Russian media, well, obviously state-controlled during the last years since 2014, that the population of Russia was getting prepared for this war, for this aggression, for the genocide of Ukrainians. They were being told that Ukrainians are not real people, that they are actually not people, that they are worth to be exterminated because they are Nazis, or they are possessed by devil, or they are the Western stooges, or whatever, that they do not have right to exist, dehumanized. So they were dehumanized. But what Ukrainians are trying to do now in diaspora and inside Ukraine is actually kind of making the world aware that this is not something out of normal Russian modus operandi versus Ukraine, that this has happened in history before, that Ukrainians tried to resist but they failed, and that's why Ukrainians can't afford for their resistance to fail this time.
And I think there are some fundamental things that people don't understand about Russian history, and this is where it feeds into a lot of the debate that's happening on Twitter and other places at the moment, and that is that the history of the Russian state tends to follow cycles between repression and liberalisation. But that's a sort of crude generalisation, because typically under the repressive regimes, you will have military disasters and defeats, which will then prompt, the Russian elite to think about how they need to change and reform society, not to make it better for individuals, but so that they can reform their military for the next conflict. Because I think a lot of people fail to realize that Russia is an incredibly militarized society and has actually been for centuries. And that's one of the worries now, isn't it? Putin, with his repression, with his extreme corruption and nepotism, has shown that the Russian military is inept, incompetent, poorly equipped, poorly led, and lacks the required training. The next regime in Russia, whether it's an extreme nationalist one or a liberal one, could actually improve the military. It could implement reforms which the West looks at face value and says, oh, well, that's improving society. Whereas in actual fact, the reforms are there to get Russia ready for the next wave of aggression and then the lessons of failure. And I think this is the problem that many Ukrainians have with the ideas of a liberal regime in Russia. If you simply have a liberal regime that tackles corruption and improves their ability to fight, then that is not useful in any sense. What you need in Russia is a regime that is going to deconstruct the federation, that is going to decolonize Russia before it even thinks about any kind of military industrial reforms.
Yes, you are absolutely right, and many Ukrainians actually, they are very distrustful towards Russian liberals, towards Russian opposition leaders, or at least many of them or most of them who are in the West, but they are not speaking up about, you know, the need to deconstruct the empire, to destroy the Russian empire and its imperialist ambitions towards its neighbors. But they are only concerned about, you know, less corruption in Russia and making the country and the state system and the government more efficient. And, you know, and many Ukrainians are saying, well, they are only worried about, you know, reducing the corruption so that their army could kill us more efficiently. And while, you know, it might seem like radical argument at first, in fact, it isn't, because it shows, like, if we really analyze the statements of, you know, some Russian opposition politicians and even some Russian opposition liberal media that are now headquartered in Western countries, and notably the case with the Rain TV in Latvia. When, you know, there was a scandal when one of their hosts mentioned during the broadcast that they were helping to raise the money for Russian soldiers to help somehow equip them better. And, you know, and then there was an attempt of the editors to refute that statement and say that, well, they didn't intend it. They actually do not help a Russian army, but, you know, the wave was already there and it was very difficult to somehow mitigate the effect of this very controversial statement. And well, obviously, you know, for Ukrainians, it's kind of black and white now. If you are really, you know, for Ukraine and you support Ukraine, as many Russian liberals and opposition figures and liberal media claim to do, then you cannot care about improving the conditions for the Russian army. All you should care of is about actually helping Ukraine, also sending the money to Ukraine to support Ukrainian resistance. And you should be speaking about, you know, decolonizing Russia and getting rid of this imperialist mindset that enables these wars in the first place. And that's, you know, the test that many Russian liberals are failing to do. Well, we can talk about why, because they are all, their own mindset is imperialist, or because they do not want to lose the audience inside Russia, which is not ready to this kind of things. You know, the audience that still might not support war against Ukraine, but still has this imperialist vision of Russia and all other Russia's neighbors as brotherly or nations or lesser Russias or whatever. So it's still a very, you know, long way to do. I myself find what Hari Kasparov says, the former chess champion and one of Russian opposition leaders who lives in the US, very relevant. And, you know, he's probably the only Russian opposition leader who has the courage to speak about the need of a complete military defeat of Russia, about the deconstruction of Russia as an empire, you know, about the collapse of Russian Federation, that the subjects of the Federation should be supported in their desire to become independent or have bigger autonomy. But it takes courage, you know, to say these things, obviously, for Russia now. But without this, I think the war in Ukraine and other wars that are waged by Russia will not be stopped, and they will continue after short breaks, after Russia, you know, just uses the time to rearm and regroup and then attack again. So there should be this reckoning with Russian imperialist past, the complete reconsideration of the Russian view of itself and its neighbors, and, you know, the recognition of right of self-determination, not just on paper, but in fact of, you know, former Russian colonial subjects. It's a long process, but we have to, you know, talk about that. We have to insist on that. And I hope that also in the West there is more realization of the importance of this. You know, Ukrainians are speaking about that. Other, you know, former members of the Soviet Union, like Baltic states, and increasingly Kazakhstan and other, you know, Central Asian states are speaking about that. But in the West, I think this topic is still overlooked, and somehow people are even, and the governments are even scared to think about the collapse of Russia, of Russian Federation, about decolonization of Russia, the fact that, you know, that only by ensuring the deconstruction of Russian Empire we can ensure stable peace and stability in the world.
That's right. And I think it comes back to something we sort of talked about earlier, and that is the lack of strategic thinking, probably in the West as well, but also traditionally, even amongst the Russian intelligentsia, the thinking tends to be far more sort of tactical than longer term and strategic. And I mean, there are only three people that I've heard unambiguously talk about not just decolonization as a concept, but how you actually might go about it. There's Kasparov, there's Khodorkovsky, who a couple of years ago was dead against this, but his point of view is moving definitely more towards a deconstruction or a loose federation as part of a decolonization process. And the writer Viktor Shindyarovich, who has been very unambiguous for many years now about the need for de-imperialization. I mean, the challenge here is, firstly, they're all Jewish. So, I think Russians are going to be less receptive, perhaps, to those points of view due to fairly sort of, obvious prejudices there. But also, they're not going to want to listen to an ex-oligarch, tell them how to deconstruct the society, especially a Jewish oligarch. This is the challenge, isn't it? Is that, you need mainstream voices in Russia to adopt these ideas, or they're not really going to get much traction. And Navalny's team don't seem to be putting forward a coherent plan, not only on how you decolonize, but actually how you tackle the FSB and GRU and the sort of secret state elites that tend to have, far more power in Russia than they do in Western societies.
Well, I think it is obvious now, almost 1 year since Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that this change in Russia cannot come from within. We've seen that there were no really significant public protests in Russia against the invasion. Well, those Russians who are against it, they mostly acted by, showed their resistance by fleeing Russia, by going abroad. And well, some of them fled initially, others fled after Putin announced mobilization. So we can actually argue whether these people were against the war, against the invasion, or they were just fleeing because of their fear to be mobilized and sent to actually die in this war. So in this situation, when it seems pretty obvious that the change cannot come from inside Russia, I think the necessary precondition for this change is a complete Russian military defeat. So this is something, without which there will be no change and no, recognition of the past crimes and no rethinking of the future of Russia. Ukrainians are, insisting that this military defeat should happen, that it should be crushing. But of course, Ukraine needs the support of the West in that. And many in the West, it seems, are more afraid of Ukraine's victory than the victory of Russia, or they are at least afraid of the Russian defeat, because they say, well, it will bring a lot of uncertainty. And well, of course, yeah, it will bring a lot of uncertainty. But on the other hand, if this defeat doesn't happen, there is a certainty what will happen next. And this means more aggression, more, authoritarian, totalitarian slide inside Russia, more instability in Europe and, in the world. So I'm not sure that this certainty is better than the uncertainty that the collapse of and the military defeat of Russia would bring. And it's very important to kind of overcome those fears. I know it's hard, it's not easy, but it's very important to work together towards the defeat of Russia, because only that can give a way to the change inside Russia. The primary goal of this change really should be to make sure that these aggressive wars of imperialism will not happen again in the future. That this last global empire should collapse and should become, a normal state abiding by the rule of law. Because until that happens, Russia will be a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to the entire global stability. We see how the war in Ukraine affected so many countries all over the world with the food insecurity, you know, how the Iranian regime is thriving thanks to the cooperation with Russia. Now they are moving even closer. Probably the risks are to the nuclear non-proliferation. The risks are increasing because, well, obviously Russia is transferring something in return to Iran for the supply of its kamikaze drones and other weapons and other equipment. So, you know, until Russian empire collapses, until Russia is militarily defeated in Ukraine, which is the step one leading to this future collapse, there will be this threat. The threat will be only growing and the instability will only deepen.
I think that's absolutely true. And, you know, my last question is going to be more positive and action orientated, and it's going to be about what people in the West can do to help tackle war fatigue. But I wanted to make a point from what you said as well. You know, it's not just about defeating Russia as the bad guy, which of course they are, and a malign influence around the world, but also this imperial attitude and the extreme nepotism and corruption that is required to sustain this imperial model. You know, it has a hugely deforming impact on Russian culture itself. You know, it crushes innovation. It destroys the ability of Russian culture to move forward and you know, generate new forms and be vibrant in the way that, of course, we're seeing Ukrainian culture. That you know, that imperial attitude requires a huge deformation of the power structures. It requires control over culture, because if culture gets too vibrant, it becomes a threat to the regime. And also, it has to remember that to sustain an imperial model like the Russian one takes vast amounts of wealth. That wealth can then not be used for education, to improve living standards, and to promote, you know, a vibrant, innovative culture. So it's in Russians' own interests to move away from the historical model, which has destroyed their culture, in my view. You know, you look back in periods of Russian history, and it has its own periods of renaissance and originality. The late 19th century and the Silver Age. Russia itself started to have a kind of renaissance of culture and produced extraordinary works. But then this imperial lust came in and crushed every time, you know, its opportunity to move forward and evolve as a society.
Yes, well, I agree with what you've said. And, you know, coming back to the question of what the people in the West can do to overcome war fatigue, but also to help deconstruct the Russian Empire. You know, the issue of wealth and the money that you mentioned is very crucial. In one of our previous conversations, we talked about Russian money in London, in the UK, you know, how it enabled, how it whitewashed the Russian oligarchs, the Russian regime, how it corrupted also, you know, the UK society and the UK political class. And, well, luckily we see that still the response to war in Ukraine has been, you know, very strong in terms of support to Ukraine in the UK, and that didn't play a role. Those money, they were not able to corrupt or, you know, derail the solidarity that the people in the UK and the government has shown with Ukraine. But this is not the case in many other countries of the European Union even. You know, there are countries where Russia invested significant amounts of money in its even cultural institutions. You know, we spoke a lot about culture today, but culture is very often, you know, a political tool for Russia. It's a tool of disinformation, is a tool of buying influence. At the same, you know, it happened in Italy, it happened in Germany, it continues to happen. And the process of also realization inside these countries of how, you know, Russia has been corrupting not only the political class in these countries, and the West scandals with the political parties receiving finances and, you know, receiving money from the Kremlin that are currently under investigation. Some of these parties still are parts of the government coalitions, well, like in Italy with the far right Lega Nord. But, you know, the process of like this understanding of the Russian threat in terms of the dirty money, in terms of the so-called cultural institutions, which are actually tools of geopolitical influence, of malign influence, of disinformation, of undermining of democracy, that this process is still very slow. And it's very important to talk about that and to be aware of that, because Russia, it uses this somehow complacency and, ingenuity of the Western societies and the willingness of some parts of the societies to be corrupted, to be bought, to be, used as tools, as assets. But there should be more pressure from the people, from the media, more investigations about that, from the law enforcement agencies. Hopefully we are on track, and hopefully, there is more awareness now about the threat that Russia poses, not just, to Ukraine, but to democratic countries. I hope, this continues and this influence is countered and exposed and ultimately defeated.
And anything people can do, I mean, going along to demos, going to concerts, getting more involved, continuously educating themselves about propaganda narratives, of course, but also educating themselves about Ukrainian history, I think, is incredibly important. And we'll pop a link in the description of the video to the lectures, especially of Timothy Schneider, that are incredible. But also, any other cultural figures, any articles that people should be reading, especially the podcast you mentioned that the philosopher Yarmolenko is doing. We'll pop those links into the description of the video. Well, Olga, I know we'll speak again as events unfold, and especially when Ukrainian victory comes. I think we'll need to have a sort of special session to dissect that. Yes. But I'm extremely grateful to you once again for helping us to unpack the complexities, and also for the incredible positivity with which you approach things, which we have to admit are very stressful. They're exhausting, stressful, emotionally, but you always come with solutions, which is fantastic.
Well, I want to thank you, Jonathan, for your attention to this topic, to the issue of Russian disinformation, propaganda, and also all the cultural, notions and the cultural appropriation and theft that we discussed in such a great detail today. Maybe a bit, going in another direction from the original topic of our conversation, but I think it's really important, and I'm amazed by also your knowledge of these issues, and I really appreciate that so many people across the world are discovering Ukraine, are interested to discover it. They want to learn more, they want to dig deeper. So it's our goal as Ukrainians to respond to this request, to share, what we know, to share our love to our country, and to help, others discover Ukraine. And speaking about the positivity, I'm drawing it from my fellow Ukrainians when I look at what they do on a daily basis, how they resist, how they struggle, and how they cope with a very difficult reality every day, but they do not give up. They continue fighting, they continue building new Ukraine and telling the world what Ukraine is. And, I can't help but being inspired by them.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Olga, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.